Welcome to Today I Will Take You on a Journey into My Own World. The Owl Who Watched the World. She had been sitting in that tree for 11 years. She had seen everything. The night she decided to act was the night everything changed. Every village has a secret. Ashenmere had an owl. She had appeared the winter that Thomas Wren's barn burned down. No one's fault, everyone agreed, though they agreed this with the specific emphasis of people who suspect it was someone's fault, but have decided communally not to pursue the matter. The owl had arrived that same week, settling into the ancient oak at the center of the village green, as though she had always been there, as though the branch had been waiting for her particular wait. She was enormous, as owls go, great-horned, with tufts that gave her a permanently skeptical expression, and eyes the color of new copper coins, that vivid, impossible yellow that catches firelight from across a field. The children named her Magistra, which was the Latin word for teacher, because the schoolmaster, Mr. Corvin, had told them owls were symbols of wisdom, and they had taken him at his word with the literal enthusiasm of children who have not yet learned to be ironic about anything. Magistra did not act wise. She acted watchful, which is not the same thing. She sat on her branch in the oak on the village green night after night, and she watched. She watched the baker's wife come home late from a direction that was not the direction of the market. She watched the miller's son bury something in the garden at 2 a.m. She watched the old priest sit on his doorstep and drink from a bottle he kept inside his coat and look at the sky with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite prayer, and was its own particular third thing. She watched Lena Marsh. Lena was 17, the daughter of the innkeeper, and she had the quality some people have of moving through their circumstances without being fully contained by them, as though she were slightly too large for the life she had been given, bulging at its edges in ways she could not entirely control or suppress. She was kind, which in Ashenmere was not always an advantage. She noticed things, which was a more serious liability. She had been offered a position at the great house on the hill, cleaning and serving, and she had declined it, which had confused and quietly offended the Wren family, who owned the great house and had not previously encountered a refusal. What Lena was doing, when she could, was writing. She wrote in the margins of old invoices from her father's inn, on the backs of letters that had already been read and answered, on whatever surface was available. She wrote stories. Not the stories of Ashenmere, or not directly. She was too careful for that, and she understood enough about the village's relationship with its own image to know that writing its stories down was a form of provocation it would not forgive. She wrote stories that were adjacent to Ashenmere, stories of a village that rhymed with hers, where things happened that rhymed with the things happening in the one she lived in. Magistra watched her write. This is the part that requires the most careful explanation, because it is also the part that sounds least believable. The owl understood what Lena was doing. Not in the way a human understands writing, not linguistically, not with any awareness of the specific words or sentences or the metaphors Lena deployed with increasing confidence as she got older and more practiced, but in the way that any very observant creature understands pattern. Lena wrote when she was agitated. Lena wrote when she had seen something that didn't fit. Lena's body language while writing was the body language of someone processing something true through a medium that made it bearable. Hunched slightly, jaw set, the pen moving with a speed that was not the speed of composition, but the speed of transcription. as though she were taking down something that already existed and simply needed recording. Magistra recognized this. She did not have a word for it. She had something older than words, a pattern recognition that noted, this creature is doing something important. This creature is doing something the other creatures in this territory are not doing, and probably would not understand. The winter Lena turned 19, something happened in Ashenmere that the village's mechanism for collective forgetting was not quite equipped to handle. A girl went missing. Her name was Sarah Finch. She was 14, and she had last been seen walking home from the Wren estate, where she worked in the laundry. The village searched for a week. The village did not find her. The magistrate came from the county seat, asked questions, wrote things in a ledger, and left without resolution. The Wren family expressed appropriate concern. Thomas Wren, the patriarch, expressed it with the particular fluency of a man who has had occasion to express concern before and has become practiced at calibrating its depth and duration. Lena wrote for 3 days straight. Magistra watched her from the oak, and then, on the 4th night, did something she had never done before. She flew to Lena's window. She landed on the sill. It was past midnight. Lena was at her table, writing by candlelight, her face bent close to the page. She looked up at the sound of the owls landing, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. The girl who noticed things, and the creature who had been watching everything. Across the narrow gulf of the open window. Lena said, "You've seen something, haven't you?" This was not a question. It was an inference made by someone who had spent 2 years watching the owl watch the village, who understood that the owl's regular perch gave her a sight line that included the road to the Wren estate, who was now doing the mathematics of what the owl might have seen and what that seeing might mean. Magistra did not answer. Owls cannot answer. But she held Lena's gaze with those copper coin eyes for a long moment, and then she turned her head, all the way in the unsettling fashion of owls, and looked north, toward the estate, toward the long outbuilding behind the estate, the one that was always locked, the one whose purpose had never been clearly explained. Lena looked where the owl was looking. Then she looked back at the owl. She said, "I know. I've been trying to figure out how to say it." What happened next is the part of the story that belongs to the legal record rather than this telling. The inquiry that Lena's written account prompted, delivered anonymously to the county magistrate with enough specific detail to require investigation. The discovery that was made in the locked outbuilding. The series of events that followed, which disrupted Ashenmere in ways it is still, decades later, not entirely comfortable with. The Wren family lost the great house. The magistrate from the county seat came back, and this time he stayed much longer. And he brought people with him. Sarah Finch came home. Lena left Ashenmere the following spring. She went to the city, where she found work first as a copyist, and then, over time, as a writer of some reputation. She wrote about villages that rhymed with the one she came from, about the things that happen when people decide communally not to notice something, about the specific quality of attention that is required to see what is actually there rather than what everyone has agreed to see. She wrote, in one of her later books, about an owl, about a creature that had watched everything and understood, in its old, wordless way, that the girl with the pen was the one who could do something with what had been seen. About the night the owl flew to the window and looked north, and the girl looked with her. She dedicated the book to Magistra, who watched until watching was not enough, and then did the only thing she could. The oak tree is still there, in the center of the Ashenmere village green. The branch is still there, a particular branch, thick and level, worn smooth in one spot where something heavy sat for a very long time. The owl, of course, is gone. Owls do not last as long as trees. But the smooth spot on the branch remains, and the old people of Ashenmere, who remember, sometimes touch it when they pass, the way people touch things that meant something. Not quite superstitiously, not quite not. Some of them say she still comes back on certain nights when something in the village needs watching. Some of them say this is sentimental nonsense, and the smooth spot is just where the bark wore away. Both groups look at the branch when they say it, just in case. The architect of small things. He built things no one could see, until the day someone finally looked. Marcus Fell built bridges between moments, not metaphorical bridges, actual structures, mathematically sound, load-bearing, with proper foundations and appropriate clearances. They were simply invisible to everyone except him. And, as it turned out, one other person. He had discovered the ability at 8 years old, by accident, in the way most of his important discoveries happened. He was trying to do something else entirely and stumbled into something he had no framework for. He had been trying to reach a jar of jam on a high kitchen shelf, and in his frustration he had thought, with a clarity that was more architectural than emotional, about the distance between his hand and the jar, and about what would need to exist in that distance to make the reaching possible. And something had happened in the air between them. He called it a step, which was not technically accurate, but was accurate enough for a child. It was a step, a platform of compressed and structured space, solid under his foot, that allowed him to reach the jam. He had stepped onto it, reached the jar, stepped off it, and stood in the kitchen with jam and with the beginning of a very long confusion. The step had dissolved almost immediately. It did not leave a mark. No one else had been in the kitchen. He had eaten the jam on bread and thought about what had happened with the careful, methodical attention of a child who is used to being told that what he sees is not what is there, and who has therefore learned to examine his own perceptions very rigorously before reporting them. He did not tell anyone. He practiced. By the time Marcus was 12, he could build structures that lasted for several hours. By 17, several days. By the time he entered university to study, of course, structural engineering, he could build things that persisted for weeks, and he had refined his ability from simple platforms into something much more complex. Stairs, arches, suspended walkways, small rooms made of structured air and focused intention, invisible to everyone but him, and solid enough to sit in. He built them in places that needed them. This was how he thought about it. Some places have a structural problem that the visible architecture doesn't address. A courtyard where the acoustics created a dead zone that felt oppressive. He built a curved wall of invisible sound-deflecting surface that changed the way the space felt, without anyone being able to explain why it had changed. A stairwell in a hospital where the angles were subtly wrong, where something about the proportions created anxiety in the people using it, without their knowing what caused the anxiety. He built a counterstructure that corrected the proportions from within. invisible. And the nurses who used that stairwell reported feeling less stressed without being able to say why. He made a career in visible architecture because he needed to eat, and he was very good at it. His buildings had a quality that clients described in various ways: calm, right, inhabitable in a deeper sense than other buildings, without being able to articulate what produced the quality. Marcus knew. He built things inside his buildings, inside the spaces that conventional construction left unaddressed. Small structures of focused intention that corrected imbalances and eased the specific discomforts that spaces can create in the people who move through them. He was 41 when he met Yuki Tanaka at a building site in a city neither of them lived in, both of them there for professional reasons that were entirely coincidental and which Marcus had stopped believing in coincidence about by the time he was 20. She looked at the corner of the building site where he had built an invisible shelter. Just a simple thing, 4 walls and a roof of structured space, because it had been raining and he had needed somewhere dry to eat his lunch. And she said, without preamble, "How long did that take you?" He stopped. He turned. He looked at her. She was looking at the corner where the shelter was, not through it, at it, with the specific quality of attention that meant she was seeing it. He said, "About 20 minutes. I'm faster when I'm hungry." She said, "The load distribution on the north side is slightly off. It's been compensating, but it would come down in a strong wind." He looked at the shelter he had built. He looked at the north side. She was right. They had lunch in the shelter, both of them, which made it the first time in 33 years that Marcus had shared a space he had built. She fixed the north side load distribution while he watched, with the ease of someone adjusting something she had adjusted 1,000 times before. The rain came down around them and left them dry in a structure no one else on the building site could see. She had found it at 6. She built things differently than he did. Softer, less architectural, more organic. Structures that curved and breathed, rather than the precise load-bearing geometries Marcus preferred. Her buildings, she said, were more like weather than architecture. His were more like math. They were, between them, the first 2 people either of them had ever met who could do what they did. They compared notes for 6 hours. They went to dinner and compared notes for 4 more. The restaurant was confused about why the table in the corner felt so unusually comfortable, and why the ambient noise seemed muffled in just that area. But it was a very good restaurant with good instincts, and it simply ensured that corner table was always available, and never tried to explain why guests requested it. They did not fall in love, which would have been the easy story. They became something that did not have a name, a collaboration, a mutual recognition, a partnership built on the shared experience of having done something alone for a very long time and suddenly not having to. They worked on buildings together. His mathematics, her intuition. His precision, her capacity for organic form. The buildings they made together had a quality that their individual buildings had. Always had, but multiplied. An inhabitable depth that made people slow down in them, look around, breathe differently. No client ever asked why. Clients rarely ask why something feels right. They ask why things feel wrong, and they demand corrections. And they are very specific about the corrections they want. But rightness, inhabitable, structural, mathematical rightness, they simply accept, the way they accept good weather. They don't question it. They just feel better. Marcus and Yuki built things for 30 years. They built them in cities and small towns, and one extraordinary week in a forest where the trees had a structural problem he couldn't explain, and she solved in an afternoon by building something that sang very quietly in frequencies too low for human hearing, but exactly right for the specific architecture of old wood under stress. Marcus retired first. He built himself a small house in the countryside, visible and invisible simultaneously, the outer structure. Conventional and unremarkable. The inner structure, a series of spaces within spaces that he had spent 3 years designing, and that he spent his retirement living inside. Yuki visited twice a year and always adjusted something, always found something he had missed, always fixed it with the organic ease that still, after 30 years, made him slightly envious. The house is still there. A new family lives in it now. They report unanimously that it is the most comfortable house they have ever inhabited, that they sleep better there, that their children are calmer, that something about the proportions is simply right in a way they cannot explain. They are not wrong. The invisible structures are still standing. Unlike most built things, they are not subject to the ordinary processes of deterioration. They are made of something that does not rust, or crack, or settle, or wear. Marcus was never entirely sure what he was made of, but he was sure of this: it lasted. Some things built with enough care and attention simply persist. That is not magic. That is just what good building does. The Translator's War. She spoke 7 languages. The one that mattered most had no words at all. The war had been going on for 3 years before anyone thought to ask Irina Malik what she heard when the two sides spoke to each other. When they finally asked, she told them. Nobody was ready for the answer. Irina had grown up in a city that had changed hands 4 times in her grandmother's lifetime, which meant she had grown up in a household where language was a practical problem rather than an identity. Her grandmother spoke the old language. Her mother spoke the language of the first occupation fluently, and the language of the second occupation adequately. Irina's father had been in the diplomatic service and spoke 5 languages, and had died in the third occupation under circumstances the family did not discuss. Irina herself had been identified at age 11 as having a particular aptitude, the kind that goes beyond facility, beyond even fluency, into something that her teachers struggled to name, but that amounted to this: she did not translate, she inhabited. When Irina spoke a language, she spoke it from inside. Not with an accent, not with the slightly formal grammatical correctness of someone who has learned a language rather than absorbed it, but with the specific music of a native speaker. The shortcuts and elisions and tonal habits that are not taught because they do not need to be taught to someone born into the language, who breathes it rather than speaks it. She spoke 7 languages this way. She was working on an 8th. The war, when it came to her city, which was the 4th time the city had been caught in something larger than itself, was between 2 factions whose political and historical grievances were real and legitimate on both sides, which made everything worse, because it is much easier to end a war where one side is simply wrong. Irina was extracted from the city in the 2nd month by a humanitarian organization that needed interpreters and had been told she was the best available. She was 34. She had no particular feelings about being extracted. She had spent her life being moved by forces larger than herself, and had developed a relationship with movement that was not quite acceptance and not quite indifference, but was its own functional thing. She was brought to the negotiation compound, a former hotel in a neutral city 200 kilometers from the conflict, and installed in a room with bad plumbing and a window that looked out on a concrete wall. And she was told that her job was to facilitate communication between the two delegations who would be meeting in the conference room on the second floor. She asked to read the existing transcripts before the first session. They gave her 3 days' worth. She read them in an afternoon. When the lead mediator, a Finnish diplomat named Kari Halston,
had negotiated 11 ceasefires in 4 decades, and who did not impress easily, came to check on her. She was sitting with the transcripts spread across the bad plumbing room's floor, and she was looking at them with an expression he could not read. She said, "They're not disagreeing about what they say they're disagreeing about." He said, "What are they disagreeing about?" She said, "That's more complicated. Give me the session recordings, not the transcripts. The recordings." He gave her the recordings. She listened to them with headphones, twice through, making notes in a small book she carried that was covered in her own notation system, a hybrid of 3 different languages' phonetic alphabets with her own additions. When she came to the 3rd session, she stopped the recording, rewound it, listened to a particular exchange 4 times, and wrote something in the notebook and underlined it twice. The next morning, in the conference room, she did something interpreters are not supposed to do. She interrupted. The head of the first delegation, a general, large and deliberate in his movements, a man who communicated primarily in declarative statements, had just finished a speech that Irina had been rendering accurately into the other delegation's language. The head of the second delegation, a woman named Alinta Varga, who had been a lawyer before she became a politician, before she became a peace negotiator, was preparing to respond with the response she had prepared. Irina said in the general's language, "General, before the response, I need to ask you to clarify something. When you say your delegation requires acknowledgement of the losses of 1987, you mean the acknowledgement should come first, before any discussion of territorial arrangements? Yes?" The general looked at her with the look men of his type often give translators who speak out of turn. He said, yes, that was correct. Irina said in Alinta Varga's language, "Director Varga, your delegation has been understanding the general's position as saying that territorial acknowledgement is a precondition for loss acknowledgement. I'm telling you, that is not what he has said. He has said the opposite. Loss acknowledgement first, territorial arrangements second. These are not the same negotiation." Silence. Halston, who had been in 11 ceasefires in 4 decades, sat very still. Alinta Varga looked at Irina for a long moment. Then she looked at the general. She said, in the careful phrasing of someone reformulating a position they have held for 3 days, "Is that correct?" Irina translated. The general said yes. He said it with the additional weight of a man who has not previously been correctly understood and who is recalibrating his assessment of this process. The session ran 4 hours longer than scheduled. What Irina had heard in the recordings was not a translation problem in the ordinary sense. Both delegations had competent interpreters. The words were being rendered accurately. What was being lost was something beneath the words, the specific tonal and rhythmic patterns that, in both languages, carried information about priority and sequence that the grammatical structure of the sentences did not make explicit. In the general's language, the order in which things were said encoded the order in which he believed they should happen. In Alinta Varga's language, the same construction was idiomatic. a conventional opening phrase that carried no sequential meaning. 3 days of negotiation had been conducted on the basis of a fundamental misunderstanding that no one had caught, because everyone involved was listening to the words, and no one had been listening to the music. Irina spent 6 weeks in the compound. She interrupted 11 more times, which was 11 more times than interpreters were supposed to interrupt, and each time she was technically out of order. And each time Halston, after the first 2, simply let her do it, because he had the
evidence of what happened when she did and what happened when she didn't. The ceasefire was signed on a Tuesday. Irina was present. She was not in the photographs, which was standard. Interpreters are not in photographs at signings. She sat at the end of the table and rendered the final language of the agreement aloud, first in one language and then the other. And as she spoke, she made very small adjustments, each one defensible as a matter of idiomatic rendering, each one calibrated to ensure that when each delegation read the agreement in their own language, the priorities and sequences were clear and matching. Halston knew what she was doing. He had reviewed her work closely enough by that point to understand it. He said nothing. The document was what it needed to be. Irina went back to her city, which was in the process of becoming again the city it had been before this particular war, in the way that cities do, slowly, imperfectly, with the specific combination of resilience and scar tissue that is all any city can manage. She was asked later by a journalist writing about the negotiations how she had known to interrupt that first time, what she had heard that no one else had heard. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "I heard what they needed from each other, not what they were saying, what they needed. The saying was in the words. The need was in the music of the words. I speak the music. That is all I did." The journalist wrote this down and then looked up and said, "That sounds simple." Irina said, "It's the simplest thing in the world. Most people never learn to do it because they learn to listen to the words first, and the music becomes background. I learned the music first. Everything else is just vocabulary." She taught for 20 years after that. Not languages. She taught listening. She taught it in the way it had never been formally taught before, because it had never been formally codified, because the people who could do it had always simply done it without examining the mechanism. Her students described her classes as disorienting, which she took as a compliment. She taught them to hear what was under the words, the structure of need and priority and sequence that runs beneath language like a current beneath water, invisible from the surface, completely determinative of where the water actually goes. Some of them learned it, not all. The ones who learned it went into every field: medicine, law, diplomacy, teaching, counseling, business. They reported back, over the years, that the skill changed everything. Not because it gave them information others didn't have, but because it allowed them to be in conversations at a depth where the real conversation was happening, where it had always been happening, while everyone else was listening to the words.